What's up, everybody? Peter Exodus of Coffee here for another episode of Three Things of the Month. So doing May a little late, but hey, it's happening. That's all that matters. So I'm gonna break the rules a little because I'm a Gemini and that's kind of what we do. And I'm doing four things. So thing number one, and this is a I love when I get excited about something. I love to dive in and really explore things. And so I'm doing various reading when it comes to music history. So right now I am going through and party every day. Three authors, but the lead author is Larry Harris, and this is about Neil Bogart and Casablanca Records in the '70s. And Casablanca had launched Kiss, had Parliament in the mid to late '70s. At the same time, Funkadelic was on Warner Brothers. Also, they broke Donna Summer and had Donna Summer and the Village People, so they were all over the place. Putting out a lot of really good music. And forgot to mention, in April when I brought some things out of this book that there's a movie out now called Spinning Gold that also is kind of a biopic on Neil Bogart's life. So Neil really hit the scene hard, and Casablanca is legendary from the '70s. Uh, but kind of fade, kind of what here and supernovaed and passed away very early. But he's a very influential. One of the things that intrigues me is as you know George is in his '70s, pushing '80, Kiss is in their '70s, but they're talking about going on even after they retire. And so it's for Parliament, for P Funk, and for Kiss. And I think the link that those two share is Neil Bogart. So that's kind of my interest here. Um, but going back to the last episode, and I mentioned that Neil, um, back before he started Casablanca in the late '60s, he had Kama Sutra Records, and can't remember what was there with Kama Sutra, forgetting the name. But I talked about it last episode, and but there's mafia involvement. So lo and behold, I'm always on YouTube and ran across a gentleman named Michael Frazese, and that is spelled Franzese. And Michael was he's a former capo in the Colombo family. So he's former mafioso, spent some time in jail, went to jail, found Jesus, and now is doing a YouTube channel talking about all things mafia. So he does talk about the mafia in the film business. So The Godfather wasn't totally out there in part one. The first Godfather movie, they did have some mafia influence out there. And I haven't watched that episode yet, but I do. But the interesting thing is I talk about a couple instances of mafia influence in the music business I run across. And I talked about Karma Sutra and Buddha Records. That was the other one that connected with Kama Sutra Records, Buddha Records, that Neil Bogart. Turns out Michael Franzese's dad was the silent owner, mafia owner there with those two labels. So it's interesting. There's a whole episode on that. And he also has two other, so that's in the mafia's role in the music industry. And he has the godfather of the music industry, a man named Morris Levy. And so Morris, to quote Michael Franzese, was mobbed up. And he wasn't a made member, but he was an associate, and a Jewish associate member of the mob. And he talks about some of the things Morris did. He went from pretty much the start of rock and roll, the late '40s to the early '80s, and talked about some of the ways he made money. And Yeah, Morris is pretty shady, but there's a lot of shady people in the music business. But some of the things he ran on people and got away with because hey, he was mobbed up, and this even into the early '80s. The mafia back then is not the same mafia today. Still wouldn't mess with the mafia today, but they're not. Ain't the same group from back in the day. So that's number one. Just catching up there in the mafia. Number two, and this really should have been the lead, but since I'm uh, revisiting the April episode, I mean Tina Turner passing. That's the lead for May. What a love Tina Turner, legendary. And I'm not gonna say a whole lot because I'm working on, the next few weeks I should have a tribute episode to Tina Turner because she deserves it. She's amazing. And really after she passed, I took a really deep dive. I didn't want to just jump in and kind of half-ass an episode on Tina Turner because she doesn't deserve that. And I'm a huge fan of Tina. So that's thing number two for May, Tina's passing. But I'm looking forward to doing that tribute episode on Tina because she definitely deserves it. Um, Very interesting branding there at the end of the career, which I totally love. But stay tuned, it's coming. Item three, and I'm calling this concert lineups expand across the genres. Traditionally, when you get these big tours, and it really started with, most people say it started with Lollapalooza, but back in the day, I mean, you had the Motown Review, and Motown took all of their acts on the road, which was unique back then, and is still kind of unique. Like, maybe smaller labels put their acts together. I think some of that goes on. The mid major labels, and they'll put three or four of their acts on the road and have them tour together. But it's interesting because you have these really big festivals out there. Um, and Coachella probably started this. I mean, but yeah, Coachella and Bonnaroo. Um, but I mean, back in the day, go look at the US Festival, the heavy metal festival from the early '80s. I mean, you had Van Halen there. You had Van Halen. That's the first $1 million concert, by the way, in '82. So I mean, you had Van Halen, I believe, Judas Priest. Who else was on that? Maybe Sammy Hagar, maybe but I'm throwing these. Think of hard rock in the early '80s, and the big ones were on there, and it was it was famous for being Van Halen's coming out party. But this was a classic hard rock, a festival. You weren't look. Al Green wasn't on the bill. P Funk wasn't on the bill. Barry Manilow wasn't showing up. But nowadays, these festivals, they putting everybody together. I mean, so I ran across this. Listen to this. So this is called. Trying to think of when this is. This is in Atlanta, and this is happening Sunday, September 17th, and Sunday, September 16th. Pink is the headline for this. It's called Music Midtown. So you got Pink playing, Pitbull, Billie Eilish, the 1975. This is all okay. So Friday is Pink and Pitbull. Saturday is Billie Eilish in 1975. Um, and then Sunday, listen to this: Guns N' Roses, Little Baby. I mean, right there, you're like, huh? That never would have happened back in the day. Incubus, Glorilla, hip hopper, uh, you know. But this is becoming more common, and it's very interesting. Coachella sort of did this, but you're getting these mini Coachellas and these in the cities doing all this, and of course you get a bigger crowd. But it's very Even when you look at Woodstock, I mean, it's rock with Sly and the Family Stone. I mean, James Brown was not at Woodstock. So the fact that this phenomenon is going on, I just find really, really interesting. And I'm starting to see more of this happening, popping up on my Facebook feed and um, Twitter feed and certain definitely Instagram. It's just interesting that these this concert phenomenon is expanding. So the final interesting thing I kind of want to cover for May is there's a lot of time spent in this book on Casablanca about promoting and getting your artist played on the radio, because that was everything in the 70s. And it's interesting because back in the 70s, DJs had a lot of power. I know, I believe it was a DJ in Seattle that broke Rush. Um, uh, um, Kiss was famous. The Kiss Army started in Terre Haute, Indiana, right there. I-70, right off of I-70 at the Indiana, Illinois border. And a couple Kiss fans got mad and started uh, literally picketing the radio station there because they wouldn't play Kiss. Now this isn't in Spinning Gold. This is the lore and the folklore of how the Kiss Army started. And it was one of the first huge fan clubs. I don't know if Elvis had a fan club. Elvis had a huge following, but this is the first phenomenon of the whole fan club thing. And again, so eventually Terre Haute, a radio station started playing Kiss, and so that's part of the Kiss lore. And interestingly enough, in the '90s, one of the big CD um, making facilities was in the early '90s, at least, was in Terre Haute. So yeah, so the DJs back then had a lot of power, and through the '70s and into the '80s, and then they did have program directors, but you had some power and did you go through the program director to DJs, but back then you could go directly to the DJs, and into the '80s and '90s, and the program directors became the ones with more power about getting airplay. Today it's very different. I had a friend in college who works. From college, he works in the radio industry and the Christian music. And I had a good friend who was actually a station manager and has bought up some of the couple smaller rural radio stations, but definitely changed now. The DJs have no control of the music unless they specifically say, "Hey, we're taking." I guess there's a way to bypass if they state we're taking requests. So they, the radio stations. I don't know. There's three or four, maybe five streaming services for radio stations, just like us consumers have with Spotify, and that's how they get their music. And there's an algorithm that decides what song is going to be played, and so yeah, that's kind of how radio works now. The DJs don't have no say for the most part um, about what song will be played. It's interesting because when I first started my music career, I was like, well, let me release some singles and we'll see if, any, I had no idea. And that's not, no, you can release all the singles you want. You have to get on this platform to get on the radio. And it's, to my knowledge, the only independent released music person who's gotten any radio play. There's been a couple of hip hop acts who've hit Billboard to 100, two or three in the last 4 or 5 years. But Adele, from what I understand, is not really. She's an independent. So Adele has the muscle and she's extremely talented and she can release her own. And I don't know how much it costs to get on these music platforms for radio, but um, you know, Adele's very talented and can get on that platform and can get noticed and played. The other big thing that's happened in radio that's very different from the 70s and 80s is it's very corporate and only a few people own most of the radio stations. I think it's Clear Channel. The names change, but there's three or four major folks that own most of the radio stations in the big media markets. There's still radio stations in smaller markets if you're, want to be a small business person. You can go in and buy up some of these rural radio stations and go from there. But yeah, it's very different. It's very different than what it was back in the day. So radio stations and leading into talking about promotion and what is payola. So payola is paying um, DJs and radio stations to play your music. Now here's the rub: if radio stations can take money to play music if they tell the audience that they've taken money to play the song. That's never gone over well. I mean, I think the radio stations have thought, well, if we tell them, then they'll think the song sucks, or we're being, we're manipulating the audience, and so it's been illegal. And there's a big in the late '50s when rock first broke. One of the first big rock DJs, Alan Freed, was busted for payola, and so the payola laws. Kicked in, and the FCC oversees radio, and so yeah, that's where payola comes from. And after the Alan Freed, many of the really big stations, I'm talking, New York and Los Angeles, the real big markets, Chicago probably stripped the DJs of the power to choose what gets played, and that's when the program directors came in. And as I said, I think it was the Seattle DJ that broke uh, Rush. But and other bands were still broke through DJs, but it was a lot of times it was it was Cleveland, Detroit radio had a history of breaking a lot of bands, or if not breaking them first, finding stuff and rolling with it and um, really, upping the careers of certain artists across genres. So, again, we're going back, to Detroit music. Everybody talks about New York and LA, but Detroit has an interesting history, and their DJs there are very interesting through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so what happened, the radio stations got these program managers, and then the radio or the record labels hired what they call these third party agents. And so, um, 1986 NBC did an investigation on payola and radio. And in 2007, SEC banned uh, third party loophole where you can go between the record labels and the radio station. And I think as early as the early 2010s, there was another payola scandal. So it's like every, I don't know, 10 to 15 years, there seems to be some sort of payola scandal that breaks. Now here's the rub, and here's where it gets interesting. From what I can gather in my research, payola doesn't cover the streaming services. And that's, getting on particularly Spotify, getting on the right Spotify list is just as important. Maybe radio play is still very important, but, getting on the right Spotify list are a close second now in importance. And from what I can gather, Spotify is not covered by payola. It's interesting. In 2020, Spotify introduced a program called the new discovery mode, which I did not do. I had music out at the time, and I have not done this. And how that worked is, you get a lesser percentage of your music, your payout from um, Spotify for them to promote your record. And pretty much, and there were a lot of third parties doing this. I don't know. Um, Kind of, it's interesting, when you make music, there's a lot of third parties like I'll get you on playlists, and most people say, uh, don't mess with these third parties because they're scam artists. And for what this new discovery mode that Spotify offered did not take off very well, and so and they took it down this year and kind of revamping, and they're looking to bring it back. I'm not look, Spotify's in the middle when it comes to payouts, as far as streams, and it's a fraction of a cent. I'm not giving any of that away until personally, until I see it actually works. Um, but I do think it's interesting that Payola does not um, apply to Spotify. Is it fair? No, but then the music industry's never been fair, and capitalism isn't fair. It's good to know the rules and to work around them. Do the major labels get preferential treatment when it comes to getting their songs placed in the right playlist? Yeah. Do we know how much they pay or all that? No, but the assumption out there, and there is a financial tie between, and a strong relationship between the three or four big labels and Spotify. Fact of life, it is what it is. I'm not going to spend a lot of energy getting, down or angry about it. It is what it is. I mean, I do music because I love music, and I'm slowly building a following, and that's what I focus on. I'm not going to get bent out of shape regarding things I can't control. So yeah, I mean, there's an assumption again that the record labels are paying Spotify to get their songs in the best playlist. There's no evidence out there, but people have looked at it. The labels are getting preferential treatment, and they got the money. So take it from it what you will. I I'm not going to hold my breath and wait for Congress and DC to make payola applicable to the streaming services. There doesn't seem to be much of a move for that, and you know again, most of the money for labels and musicians these days come through touring. If you get a billion streams, you're getting some money, and I think I'm pretty sure every single one of the 300 plus billion streams in Spotify are big label artists. So that right there says something. But they're getting paid that way, and they have the money to fight that. So I'm not going to hold my breath about Washington D.C. crusade against um, the preferential treatment that the artists on big labels probably get from Spotify. It is again, it is what it is. It's gonna, that's how capitalism works, and you know, you know, despite what people of certain political persuasions say, the government does pick favorites, and the government does protect certain groups and industries and whatnot. So uh, again, but anyway, yeah. So we'll kick it to June, and as I said, I mentioned the big story of May was the passing of Tina Turner, and touched on it. You got to mention it, with the three big things of the month for May. But as I said earlier, my Tina Turner tribute episode is coming, so look out for that. So thanks again for coming through. I got 5 albums all on the streaming services. They're here on my channel. Still waiting for album 5 to link up officially with the rest of my catalog. I guess it takes longer. My album dropped in early May, so it's been about 6 weeks, and so I have a playlist here attached to my channel with those songs, but it hasn't really linked up yet. But my other 4 albums eventually link up to my channel and my brand Peter X Disselkoffer. So it'll happen eventually. But it's hey, trying to learn this YouTube algorithm. It is what it is. But hey, they give me the power to beat them to it and do my own playlist attached to my channel. So that's what I did. So anyway, yeah. So I'm working on some singles and EPs, and keep you apprised of those, and hopefully dropping in the second half of 2023. I also have 2 science fiction fantasy novels and a novella on Amazon under Peter X's Apocrypha. So yeah, check all that out. Appreciate you coming through, and I will see you next episode.